Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our Intro to a Better Economy, Tech Economy webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started in a little bit. And I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times as we wait for people to come in. Welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started in a couple of minutes, and I'll keep repeating this message for about one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Repeat this message probably one more time, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, thank you for those of you that are just joining us. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for the room to fill in, wait for any late arrivals, and we'll get started in about 30 seconds. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our Intro to a Better Tech Economy webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through our organizing efforts, our campaign efforts, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens as we go through the presentation, but we won't be answering those questions until the end. I do want to say that the webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording afterwards via email, along with a copy of the slides and then relevant links to some of the things that we talk about today. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about the community tensions with tech. We'll talk about the bad policy choices that have predated tech's arrival. We'll talk about how tech equity fits in to combat some of these issues. And lastly, some solutions that we've identified that you can help support to ensure that this tech economy works for everyone. So let's talk about these tensions with tech. Well, communities are frustrated with the tech industry and tech overall, and it really comes to no surprise. We see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing the community. And personally, for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin and witness this really firsthand. You know, I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, for their jobs, for their homes, for their communities, but also friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and, you know, they found lots of success. Unfortunately, as the tech sector continues to expand, especially accelerated by remote work into other cities across the country, we've seen that many of these inequities experienced here in the Bay Area are beginning to replicate elsewhere. But how did we get here? Well, we know that tech didn't start the level of pain our communities have been facing for years. The inequities have been in our economy and society for decades, you know, even when Silicon Valley was still farmland. And all these feelings of frustration are understandable, like we just talked about. There's no doubt that tech has exacerbated inequality, but a lot of these issues have predated tech's arrival. And over the last couple of decades, there's been this overall shift in the balance of power that has hindered our community's abilities to prosper and to survive. So let's talk about what we've seen historically. Well, as we can see in this chart, you know, our government has cut funding for many social programs throughout the years, you know, from food security and art programming to housing, security, and medical needs. You know, our neighbors have been slowly deprived of the resources they need to live healthy and stable lives. And that shift of power has really benefited corporations. While the government was cutting back on social programs, they were simultaneously cutting taxes for large corporations in the 80s, and individual tax rates have been following the same trajectory. So that's that blue line on the chart. But we see that corporate taxes have been on a steady decline, and that's that gold yellowish line at the bottom of the chart. And just to put this in perspective, in 2019, 49% of our tax revenue, around $626 billion, was collected from individuals, and only 5%, or $59 billion, came for corporations. And these tax cuts and increases in profit for companies have come at the expense of workers and worker voice. And we know that corporations have a long history of suppressing worker power and worker voice, and there are numerous accounts of union busting and strategic attacks on worker-centered organizations that have only reinforced this profit over people approach. And a combination of all this has led to a shift in power that's still disproportionately impacting people in our economy today. Corporations have begun to flex this shift in power by entering communities and buying up apartments and homes in an effort to maximize profits. And we're seeing that corporations' bad practices as new landlords through inaccurate background checks, predatory ownership schemes, and exclusionary lending. And it's really begun to reinforce this racist and exclusionary housing practices of the past that's also known as redlining. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially within communities of color and in the Bay Area, in California, across the country, and that policy is redlining. Redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. And on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintaining their home for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. On top of these exclusionary zoning policies, it's simply too expensive to build affordable homes in our country today. Just as an example, in San Francisco, here in California, it costs about $1.2 million to build one unit of housing. And even if more housing does get built, tenants are not protected enough to be able to remain in their homes. We've seen that eviction rates and displacement rates continue to increase heavily over the years. Families have been pushed into the outer edges of major cities, further away from job centers and resources and supportive services. Just in New York, weakened tenant laws have drastically led to a decrease in homes available for people. And evictions are not just happening in expensive areas like San Francisco and New York, but also in up-and-coming tech cities like Atlanta. And eviction rates across the country are continuing to push out our most vulnerable community members away. And on top of tenants having little to no power in order to combat these evictions, they're also lacking this power in their own jobs. As we can see here, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much in the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And not having this ability to speak up and address worker injustices has led to this constant disturbing stories about worker conditions. And we're hearing about disturbing workplace practices that are putting workers at risk, both physically and mentally. And a lot of the times, the workers that are the most impacted are contract workers or people performing ghost work. Ghost work it's a term that's used to describe the kind of work that feels like it's automated, but in reality, it has a person behind the scenes performing these tasks. Like content moderation is a big one. And in our own research at TechEquity with contract workers within the tech industry, we found that contract workers receive fewer benefits and less pay than other tech employees, and while doing the same work as their directly employed counterparts, and that these workers are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian women, and non-binary people. And it's a little out of context that the tech industry came to power and centered itself as this engine of our current economy. The tech industry's position as arguably the most powerful sector of American business requires that they take some of the responsibility for how the economy has grown and is growing. And in addition, tech should employ some business practices to create products that are directly impacting the economic health of our communities. If we look at the top companies in our economy today, tech does own a lot of the market share. Just off this top 10 list, we have familiar faces like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And like we talked about, tech didn't create social and economic inequity in the US, but it has had a role in worsening inequity, and it does have a responsibility to help fix it. At TechEquity Collaborative, our community of tech workers, activists, community members, and advocates have the civic power to rebalance power within and outside the tech industry. And we identify and uncover overlooked issues of inequity so that you can champion for some of their solutions. How does tech equity work? Well, our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help our community approach these big problems and engage in systems change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, panel discussions, webinars, voter guides. We produce blogs, just really any bunch of different ways to get education out to people. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked on a huge coalition with people that were impacted by hikes in rent, state legislators, and community-based organizations to help pass this, which now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents here in California. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our work on corporate partnerships and engagements. So what are the issues we're seeing within tech and as a result of tech that we can help address? Well, within the tech sector, we're seeing these large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. Temporary, contract, and contingent workers who are hired through these contracting agencies are often doing the same work than their directly employed peers, while making less money, receiving fewer benefits, and experiencing career immobility. And at TechEquity, we've done research known as the Contract Worker Disparity Project to help uncover some of these issues. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large. And not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And we worked on the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, SB 1162 here in California, to address some of these inequities within the tech industry. There are also inequities as a result of tech that we've been working on. Tech has produced a lot of wealth, but that wealth has exacerbated our communities. People have been displaced, homes have become more expensive. However, we can repurpose this wealth to strengthen tenant protections, produce more affordable housing, and help communities organize around policies that are changing the ownership structure back into the hands of the people instead of corporations. And we've tackled these issues through our work on Prop 13 reform. Next up, we have the impact of tech products. Prop tech is an accelerating corporate takeover of single-family starter homes and renting at a mass scale. And these new companies are venture-backed, digitally enabled, and they play an increasingly influential role on the economy. And from new modes of housing construction to automated home buying, these tech-enabled companies are promising to scale massive market share and reap higher valuations along the way. So we have to be thoughtful about how we can work with companies to not reinforce these biases in their products. And we're working on this already through our Tech Bias in Housing initiative. We're also building tools, visualizations, and apps that are supporting the movement for economic justice. And you can join our team of volunteer researchers, designers, coders, data analysts that are collaborating on tough problems and sharing these new skills. And just for an example, we've had volunteers in the past help us build out a website for that Tenant Protections Act of 2019 that I talked about earlier, where people can find out whether their landlord's rent increase is illegal and how to get help to resources. And that website is tenantprotections.org, and it's already been used by tens of thousands of California renters today. And at TechEquity Collaborative, this year's key initiatives, really what we're focusing in on starts with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. It's a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that sheds light on the practice of contracting out, proposes and advocates for public policy solutions, and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias in Housing initiative, which is examining the promises and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past. And last, we have the Housing Data Initiative. Passing good policy is meaningless if those policies aren't implemented well. And together with our coalition of partners and government officials, we identify where tech can be a lever for smart policy implementation, and we enlist tech workers to build these tools that are moving us from talk to action. So what can you do at TechEquity Collaborative? Well, you can sign up to become a civic tech volunteer. You can flex your skills. You can tell your friends about us. You can contribute to the organization, or you could join me for a one-on-one conversation. I do host, quick 30-minute calls either on the phone or on Zoom, where if you want to dive deeper into the kind of work that we do, if you want to meet a fellow organizer such as myself, someone on staff, or if you just want to talk about how to best participate with the organization, I do open up my calendar for people to come talk. And you can also check us out at our next event. I'll include a link to previous events that we've hosted in the past. Like I said, we do host a lot of panel discussions that are very informative and do have different ways for you to participate in. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. I'm going to take just about a minute or two to see if there are any questions that you all may have. Like I said, the webinar is recorded and it is being sent out afterwards via email. So if you have a question afterwards as well, feel free to reply back to that email and I can answer that question. So I'll just take a minute or two. Cool. I'm not seeing any questions, which is totally fine. I want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join, our growing movement. Thank you for taking these 20 minutes to get to learn a little bit more about the history of our tech economy and hopefully things that you can do as an individual with the organization to help bring some solutions to some of the issues that we talked about. Like I said, keep an eye out on that email. Respond back to that email if you have a question or if you want to talk to me one-on-one. And I hope to see you at a future event or at a future volunteer opportunity. So thank you all for your time. Have a good weekend.